Hi, my name is Teddy Yang,
And my name is Roma Kapoor.
and this is a presentation about the Chipa, a lens into colonial syncretism and feminist resistance to state power. So what is the Chipa? Chipas, or Mbahape, the indigenous Guarani language, began as a pre-colonial bread made from cassava, animal fat, and vegetable oils, and wild honey to make the bread sweet. In the 17th and 18th century, colonialism introduced cows, cheese, eggs, horses, and many other things. But really, cheese transforms the chipa into what it is today, which is a small savory pastry filled with cheese in the center. And chipas are made from cassava starch, similarly to how they were made by indigenous people, eggs, creamy butter, salt, grated cheese, and milk. They're simple, small spears of bread and cheese that are delicious. This is a presentation about chipas, but it's really about colonial syncretism, feminist resistance, and how chipas became a mechanism for reclaiming indigenous identity within a colonial framework. So chipas are about survival of indigenous recipes and the strategic preservation of indigenous identity amidst European conquest. Chipas are about preserving dignity, they're about enabling feminist entrepreneurship, and they're really about envisioning a way for people to eat a affordable pastry on the street and engage in protest and resistance.
So, to break down the history of the Chipa, it can be traced down to pre-colonial roots, where the Gado-Guarani people who lived in present-day Aswansa, which is Paraguay, made a bread known as mabapwe. This bread was made of corn flour or cassava starch mixed with animal fat, wrapped in banana leaves, and cooked in a traditional earth oven. What this dish is emblematic of broader pre-colonial food systems that were rooted in hunting, fishing, grain cultivation, and handcrafted culinary techniques. We start to see what we know as the chipa with the colonial introduction during Juan de Ayolas's mid-16th century expedition. This led to dairy, beef, and eggs being available in South America. And this overall, combined with Franciscan missionaries, led to the birth of the chipa, where you see a combination of the indigenous cooking with European ingredients. This transformation occurred all across the modern day region of Argentina and Paraguay, specifically in towns like Ita, Agara, and Tobata.
So, looking at a quote from Ramiro Solis, he writes that long before Spanish colonization, the Guarani people were already preparing a version of chipa cooked over banana leaves. But over the years, the recipe changed and adapted once cheese and milk were readily available. So, to me, this quote really speaks to the fact that chipas are not a way of erasing indigenous culture, but it's a way of kind of coming together and forming a new thing that integrates indigenous history and knowledge with new colonial cheese and other foods. So this is an example of umbape being cooked in a earthen oven on the ground. They look different than what we're used to as a chipa. A little bit longer, like a media luna or a donut or something. I think it's really interesting to see what it looks like in the context surrounding these sort of histories and how they're transformed into a modern version.
So now to look at how the chipa is a product of colonial syncretism. To define the term colonial syncretism, it is the blending of indigenous and colonial systems such as culinary, cultural, and religious. It is not just a mixing of the indigenous and colonial colonizers' systems, but rather a response to domination where the indigenous preserve their identity under these imposed structures. We can see specifically with the chipa, it is not a product of cultural loss, but of cultural survival born from the Guarani people's strategic interpretation of adaptation of colonial ingredients into indigenous pathways, which reflects how communities preserve their identity and autonomy through everyday acts of transformation. This is because that while colonization was happening, even though we primarily focus on the Spanish's imposition of Catholicism, they also imposed a new food, livestock, and agricultural system which disrupted the Guarani's foodways that had been built around hunting, fishing, and maze, prepared with tools and methods that were deeply embedded in their worldviews. Rather than letting their traditions be erased, which were highly embedded in their own cultural identities, the Guarani communities adapted and took new colonial ingredients that they were exposed to at these missions and incorporated them into their existing cassava-based bread while at the missions. This is how chipa was born, not as a colonial invention, but as a strategic transformation and form of resistance of indigenous cooking. Specifically, we can see that this deeply plays into feminized resistance and how the chipe has played into this from its very conception to even right now with the informal labor sector. Women were the agents of this colonial syncretism, not passive recipients of colonial culture and shapers of hybrid food tradition grounded in this resistance. This legacy of resistance persisted into the 20th century and continues today with the informal labor sector. Now, we can first, to kind of go back and track our colonial syncretism, you can see the role that women played in this with the chipera. The chipera, which directly translates into the female chipa vendor, holds a special place in the Paraguayan and Argentine cultural identity and plays into a large role into why the chipa was developed in the first place. You can see this through, and as acknowledged in Swindian's Mercadio 4, a legendary vendor named Chipe Gale became a household role where her name was acknowledged in national folk songs, traditional dances, and visual art. Her chipa was so popular that it kind of propelled the chipas to become this very traditional, very popular food in the culture, and it showed to signify the quality of the chipa itself. This overall shows how women played a large role into the popularization of the chipa and its mainstream creation. By making and selling the chipe, these women who are chiparas, not just chipecale, preserved Guarani knowledge and transformed against colonial impositions, building both a gender tradition that lives in both national memory and present-day economies. This relates directly to an example we can see in the mid-20th century, specifically with Maria Ana Lopez, who was a chipa vendor. During Argentina's most turbulent moments, such as the colonial conquest, the War of the Triple Alliance, and the dictatorship, chipas have played a very vital role in women's resistance and survivals. After all these times of turmoil, many of Argentina's population was female, as their husbands died during the war, and they had to turn to informal food vending as a way to rebuild their lives and support their families amid a social collapse where the government was not supporting them. These acts of simply supporting their family were not merely just economic, but also political, as every chipa sold on the street symbolized autonomy and resistance in the absence of state support from the dictatorship or from the government failing in these times of wars. This pattern repeats countless times throughout Argentine history as we see a pattern of economic collapse. And we see that women's communal kitchens and women's street vendors through chipas became a medium for surviving on the margins when formal systems failed. This is where the example Maria Ana Lopez comes in, who is the longest serving chipera in Argentina. She began selling chipa in her 20s to gain independence from domestic servitude and build a life of autonomy and respect through street vending. Her story is not just emblematic of herself, but of all the indigenous and mestiza women who have used chipa to claim space, economy, and dignity outside of formal economic systems as a way to rebel against political systems failing or oppressing them.
Wow. So speaking about how this really impacts the informal sector, labor, it makes me think about how the story of the chipa lives on through women working in informal food economies. In Argentina, nearly half of all non-agricultural women work informally, and that number is even higher in rural regions. These jobs are often first to disappear during economic downturns because they're unprotected, low paid, and seen as dispensable. Lorena Poblete says that in 2019, only 24% of domestic workers were formally employed. Although women selling chipas are not domestic workers, there are similar struggles that there's limited labor protections and wages are very variable. And women are hit hardest during these moments due to a mix of job precarity, caregiving burdens, and structural gender bias. But instead of disappearing from the economy, many women rely on inherited knowledge, recipes, food preparation, and vending skills passed from mothers and grandmothers. Selling chipa requires little startup money, but a lot of skill and community know-how. During the COVID-19 crisis, for example, journalist Andrea Rotella Vargas lost her job in 2020 and began selling chipa and cocido on the street to support her family. The story was framed as inspirational, but she is part of a longer tradition, women using food, work as survival and strategy. From the colonial period through modern Argentina history, informal chipa vending has remained a tool for women to use to resist exclusion, feed families, and assert autonomy. Thank you very much.
Thank you.